The crack of a gunshot echoed through Willow Springs as Katherine Zamora's hands trembled, her tear-stained face reflecting the amber glow of the sunset that spilled across the dusty main street. Her father lay dead on their ranch, and Sheriff Jeremiah Blackwood's note made it clear marry him by week's end, or lose everything her family had built over 3 generations. It was 1878, and the Arizona Territory was unforgiving to a woman alone. Catherine Katie, to those who knew her before tragedy struck, was 22 years old with dreams far beyond the confines of this frontier town. Dreams that now seemed as distant as the stars that would soon blanket the desert night. "You can't hide from me, Miss Zamora," Sheriff Blackwood had told her that morning when he'd caught her trying to flee town. His fingers had dug into her arm as he dragged her back to his office. "This town needs a proper lady as its sheriff's wife, and your father's debts won't pay themselves." Katie knew there were no debts. Her father had been meticulous with his ledgers. But who would believe her word against the sheriff's? The same sheriff who controlled the town with an iron fist and a corrupt badge. 3 days later, Katie stood in the back room of the town's only church, dressed in her mother's wedding gown, altered hastily by Mrs. Peterson, who clucked sympathetically but offered no real help. The dress hung loosely on Katie's frame. She hadn't been able to eat since her father's murder. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Peterson said, pinning a wilted flower into Katie's auburn hair. "Sheriff Blackwood is. Well, he's powerful. You'll never want for anything. Except freedom," Katie thought bitterly. Except justice for her father. 20 minutes, called Reverend Wallace through the door. "Sheriff says we're to start promptly at noon." Katie's hands shook as she stared at her reflection. Her green eyes, once bright with life, now seemed dull with desperation. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not like this. Miles away, at the edge of town, Nicholas Everett pulled his horse to a stop outside the Silver Spur Saloon. Dust coated his denim pants and worn leather vest, and his sun-browned face showed the weariness of days spent riding hard. He'd come back to Willow Springs with a purpose that had haunted him for 5 years. Nick dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. At 27, he'd seen more than his share of hardship, first as a Union soldier too young for the war, then as a ranch hand, and now as a skilled horse trainer with a reputation that stretched across 3 territories. "Well, I'll be damned," a voice called from the saloon's porch. "Nick Everett, back from the dead." Nick turned to see Samuel Jones, the town's aging blacksmith, rocking in a chair outside the saloon.
"Not dead, Sam.
Just been away." Nick tied his horse, a magnificent Appaloosa named Shadow, to the hitching post. "You picked one hell of a day to come back," Sam said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Whole town's at the church. Sheriff's getting hitched." Nick's jaw tensed. "Blackwood? Who's the unfortunate bride?" "Katie Zamora. Frank's girl." Sam shook his head sadly. "Terrible business. Frank died last week, shot in the back on his own land. Sheriff says it was rustlers, but—" He trailed off. "But what, Sam?" Nick's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Folks say Frank and Blackwood had words the day before. Something about water rights and property lines." Sam looked around nervously. "Then suddenly Frank's dead, and Katie's marrying Blackwood. Girl looks like she's walking to her hanging, not her wedding." Nick's hand instinctively went to the holstered Colt at his hip. "Frank Zamora was a good man. He thought highly of you, too. Always said you were the best hand he ever hired before you took off." Sam studied Nick's face. "You and Katie were close, as I recall. That was a lifetime ago." But the tightness in Nick's chest told a different story. 5 years earlier, Nick and Katie had been young and foolish, dreaming of a life together. But then came the accusations, the threats, and finally the ultimatum from Sheriff Blackwood: leave town or hang for a theft Nick hadn't committed. Katie had been just 17 then, and Nick, barely 22, couldn't drag her into his troubles. So he'd left without a proper goodbye, carrying only the memory of her tear-streaked face when she'd learned he was going. "When's the wedding?" Nick asked, his voice rough with emotion.
Noon.
"About 10 minutes from now." Without another word, Nick untied Shadow and swung back into the saddle. He'd come back to Willow Springs to clear his name, to find evidence of Blackwood's corruption. But now there was something far more urgent at stake. At the church, Katie could hear the murmur of voices in the main hall. The entire town had turned out not to celebrate, but to witness. Everyone knew this wasn't a love match. Everyone knew what kind of man Jeremiah Blackwood was. Yet no one dared stand against him. "It's time, Miss Zamora," Reverend Wallace said, his kind eyes clouded with regret. "The sheriff is waiting." Katie took a deep breath. She had considered running again, but Blackwood's deputies watched her every move. She had considered fighting, but against what odds? She was alone now, truly alone. With leaden steps, she followed Reverend Wallace to the doors of the sanctuary. The church organ began a mournful rendition of the wedding march as the doors swung open. At the altar stood Sheriff Blackwood, his gray-streaked black hair slicked back, his impressive mustache waxed to perfection. At 45, he was more than twice Katie's age, but it wasn't his years that repulsed her, it was the cold calculation in his eyes, the same eyes that had likely watched as her father drew his last breath. Katie began the long walk down the aisle, each step feeling like she was sinking deeper into quicksand. The townspeople's faces blurred as she passed, sympathy, pity, and fear mingling in a whirl of emotions that matched her own inner turmoil. 3 steps from the altar, the church doors burst open with a bang that made everyone jump and turn. Silhouetted against the bright noonday sun stood a tall figure, hat pulled low, the gleam of a star-shaped spur catching the light as he stepped into the church. "This wedding stops now," Nick Everett's voice rang out, clear and determined. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Katie's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead like a runaway train. Nick. Her Nick. Alive and here, standing between her and a fate worse than death. Sheriff Blackwood's hand moved to rest on his holstered gun. "Everett. I thought I made myself clear 5 years ago. You're not welcome in my town." Nick walked slowly down the aisle, ignoring the whispers that followed him. His eyes were fixed on Katie, drinking in the sight of her. "It's not your town, Blackwood. And she's not your bride." Katie couldn't breathe. The years had changed. Nick, his face was leaner, more weathered, a scar running along his jawline that hadn't been there before. But his eyes, those intense blue eyes, were exactly as she remembered them in her dreams. "Nick," she whispered, the name feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on her lips. Blackwood stepped forward, positioning himself between them. "This is a legal proceeding, Everett. You're interrupting a wedding." "I'm preventing a crime," Nick countered, stopping just feet away from Katie. "Frank Zamora didn't have any debts. He didn't die at the hands of rustlers. And his daughter isn't marrying you of her own free will." A murmur ran through the church. Blackwood's face darkened with rage. "You're making accusations you can't back up, boy. Dangerous accusations." "I have proof," Nick said calmly. "Of everything. Your land grabs, your threats, your backroom deals with the mining companies. And I have witnesses who'll testify that you were on Zamora land the night Frank was killed." The church fell silent. Katie's eyes widened. Could it be true? Could Nick really have found a way to bring Blackwood to justice? "You're lying," Blackwood hissed, but uncertainty flashed in his eyes. "Am I?" Nick reached slowly into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a telegram from the territorial marshal. He's very interested in the evidence I've collected. Should be arriving on tomorrow's stage." Blackwood's face contorted with fury. He drew his gun with lightning speed, aiming at Nick's chest. Women screamed, and the congregation scattered, diving behind pews. "Drop it, Sheriff." A new voice rang out from the back of the church. Deputy Michael Collins stood in the doorway, his rifle trained on Blackwood. "I've heard enough. I've seen enough." "Collins, you treacherous, it's over, Jeremiah," Collins said firmly. "I've suspected for months, but I needed proof. Mr. Everett provided that when he came to me this morning." Katie looked at Nick with wonder. He'd been in town since morning? Had planned this confrontation? Her mind reeled with questions. Blackwood's eyes darted around the church, calculating his odds. Finding no allies, his shoulders slumped slightly, but the gun in his hand remained steady. "You think I'll hang for this? There's not a court in the territory that can touch me. I own judges from here to Tucson." "Maybe so," Nick said, taking another step forward, his hands deliberately away from his own weapon. "But you won't be marrying Miss Zamora today or any day. And once the territorial authorities hear about Frank's murder, even your friends on the bench won't be able to help you." The tension in the church was palpable. Katie held her breath, watching the two men face off, one representing everything she feared, the other everything she had lost. "She's mine," Blackwood growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I earned her. I took everything else from Frank Zamora. His daughter was just the final prize." A confession. In front of the entire town. Katie saw the shock on the townspeople's faces, the dawning horror as they realized what kind of man had been enforcing their laws. "Katie," Nick said softly, never taking his eyes off Blackwood. "Come to me." Without hesitation, Katie gathered her cumbersome skirts and moved toward Nick. Blackwood lunged for her arm, but she twisted away, years of ranch work giving her strength he hadn't expected. "You little," Blackwood swung his gun toward her. The shot that rang out wasn't from the sheriff's weapon. Deputy Collins' rifle barked once, and Blackwood staggered, a red stain blooming on his shoulder. His gun clattered to the church floor. "That's for Frank," Collins said, advancing down the aisle. "And for every other citizen of this town you've terrorized." Two more deputies appeared at the church entrance, drawn by the gunshot. They looked uncertainly between Collins and Blackwood. "Sheriff Blackwood is under arrest for the murder of Frank Zamora," Collins announced, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "Take him to the jail and send for the doctor." As the stunned deputies moved to obey, Katie found herself standing next to Nick, his solid presence both comforting and overwhelming. "You came back," she said, her voice barely audible above the chaos around them. Nick looked down at her, his eyes softening. "I should never have left." Before she could respond, the townspeople surrounded them, a flurry of questions and exclamations. Deputy Collins pushed through the crowd. "Mr. Everett, Miss Zamora, we'll need statements from both of you." He looked at Katie apologetically. "I'm sorry about your father, miss. I should have seen the truth sooner." Katie nodded, still trying to process everything that had happened in the span of minutes. Her wedding day had transformed from a sentence to, what exactly? Freedom, yes. But what else? She glanced at Nick, who hadn't taken his eyes off her. 5 years stretched between them like a vast canyon. Could they find their way back to each other across such a distance? "Let me take you home," Nick said quietly, offering his arm. Katie hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The Zamora ranch house stood silent and empty when Katie and Nick arrived. After giving their statements to Deputy Collins, they had ridden double on Shadow, Nick's strong arms around Katie as they made the familiar journey to her home. Now, as they stood on the porch, Katie felt the weight of the past week pressing down on her. Her father was gone. The ranch, their legacy remained, but the emptiness of the house threatened to swallow her whole. "I keep expecting to see him," she said, her voice breaking as she pushed open the front door. Coming in from the fields, or sitting at his desk with those reading glasses perched on his nose. Nick followed her inside, removing his hat respectfully. "Your father was a good man. One of the best I've ever known. Katie moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of whiskey with trembling hands. She changed out of the wedding dress at the deputy's office, borrowing clothes from the deputy's wife. Now dressed in a simple blouse and skirt, she looked more like the Katie that Nick remembered, strong, capable, and undeniably beautiful. "Why did you really come back, Nick?" she asked, handing him a glass. "After 5 years of silence, why now?" Nick accepted the whiskey, but didn't drink. "I never stopped thinking about you, Katie. About this place. About the life I thought I might have here." He set the glass down untouched. "I made my way up to Montana, worked the big spreads there, saved every penny I could, built a reputation training horses." "You always had a way with them," Katie said softly, memories of watching Nick gentle wild mustangs flooding back. "2 months ago, I met a man passing through from Willow Springs. He mentioned Blackwood was squeezing ranchers, taking land. Your father's name came up." Nick's jaw tightened. "I knew I had to come back. To warn Frank, if nothing else." I started gathering information along the way. Turns out Blackwood's reputation extends well beyond this town. He's been working with the railroad, helping them secure land cheaply. "That explains why he wanted our ranch," Katie said, the pieces falling into place. "The southern pasture would be perfect for the rail line they're planning." Nick nodded. "I was too late to save your father, but I couldn't let Blackwood take you too." He finally met her eyes. "I owe you an explanation, Katie. About why I left." Katie took a deep breath. For 5 years, she'd imagined this conversation, rehearsed what she would say if she ever saw Nick again. Now that the moment was here, all her prepared speeches vanished. "You left without saying goodbye," she said simply. "One day you were here, promising me the world, and the next you were gone." "Blackwood gave me no choice," Nick said, his voice rough with emotion. "He caught me checking his safe. I was looking for proof that he was stealing from the town treasury. He threatened to hang me for theft unless I left town immediately. And he made it clear that if I contacted you or tried to explain, he'd go after you and your father next." Katie's eyes widened. "So you just left to protect us?" Nick ran a hand through his hair. "I was young and scared. I thought I was doing the right thing. It took me years to realize I should have fought harder, found another way." He took a step toward her. "Not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted leaving you." Katie turned away, moving to the window that overlooked the ranch. The sun was beginning to set, painting the landscape in golds and ambers. "I waited for you. For months, I expected to see you riding up that road. I made up excuses. You were delayed. You were injured. You'd send for me when you were settled." She brushed away a tear. "Eventually, I had to accept you weren't coming back." "I'm here now," Nick said, coming to stand behind her. Close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not touching her. "If you want me to go, I will. But you should know everything I've done for the past 5 years has been working toward coming back to you." Katie turned to face him, studying the man he'd become. The boy she'd loved had been replaced by someone stronger, more determined, but with the same kindness in his eyes that had first captured her heart. "I don't know if I can trust that," she said honestly. 5 years is a long time, Nick. We're different people now." "Then let me get to know the woman you've become," he said softly. "And you can decide if the man I am now is someone worth knowing." A knock at the door interrupted them. Deputy Collins stood on the porch, looking apologetic. "Miss Zamora, Mr. Everett," he nodded to them both. "I've got news." The town council met in emergency session after what happened at the church. "They've decided to appoint me acting sheriff until the territorial authorities can send a replacement." "Congratulations," Nick said, shaking the man's hand. "That's not why I'm here," Collins said. "I've been looking through Blackwood's papers. The things that man was involved in." He shook his head in disgust. "Among other things, I found documents relating to your father's ranch, Miss Zamora. Blackwood was planning to sell it to the railroad for 10 times what it's worth after forcing you to marry him. Katie's hand went to her throat. Can they still take it?
No, madam.
The land is rightfully yours. But there's something else. Collins pulled out a folded paper from his vest pocket. This is your father's real will. Blackwood was keeping it hidden. Everything goes to you, as expected, but there's a provision about the water rights to the north section. Katie took the paper, scanning its contents. He's granting access to the Willow Creek water to all the small farms on the north border. She smiled through tears. That sounds like Pa. He was always worried about the homesteaders making it through the dry seasons. Collins nodded. It's a generous provision. Those families will be mighty grateful. He put his hat back on. I'll leave you folks be. Just wanted to deliver that personally. Oh, and the doc says Blackwood will live to stand trial. He's under guard at the jail. After Collins left, silence settled between Nick and Katie once more. The weight of the day's events hung heavy in the air. I should find somewhere to stay in town, Nick said finally. It's not proper for me to remain here. Katie hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. This ranch needs a foreman. Someone who knows the land, knows horses. She met his gaze directly. The position comes with a cabin by the creek. If you're interested. It was an olive branch, not a declaration of love or forgiveness, but a chance. A beginning. Nick's expression softened. I'd be honored, Miss Zamora. When would you like me to start? Tomorrow is soon enough, she said, the ghost of a smile touching her lips for the first time that day. The horses need tending at dawn. As Nick rode back to town to collect his belongings from the hotel, hope bloomed in his chest, fragile but persistent. He had a second chance to prove himself, to rebuild what had been broken, and maybe, just maybe, to reclaim what he'd lost. The first month passed in a blur of hard work and cautious conversations. Katie threw herself into running the ranch, determined to honor her father's legacy. Nick took his role as foreman seriously, hiring 2 new hands to replace those who'd left after Frank's death, and methodically repairing fences, outbuildings, and equipment that had fallen into disrepair. They established a routine breakfast at the main house, where they would discuss the day's tasks, then parting ways until supper, which Nick would sometimes join if Katie extended an invitation. Their conversations grew easier, less guarded, as days turned into weeks. It was during a violent summer storm that something shifted between them. Nick had been checking the herd in the south pasture when the sky turned an ominous green-black. The cattle, sensing the danger, began to stir restlessly. Nick had just turned his horse toward home when the deluge began, rain falling in sheets so thick he could barely see. Lightning cracked overhead, and thunder rumbled so loudly it seemed to shake the very ground. He urged Shadow toward the ranch house, knowing the trails by heart even in the blinding storm. As he approached, he spotted a figure struggling with the doors of the barn, which were swinging wildly in the wind. Katie, trying to secure the building before the storm tore the doors from their hinges. Nick leapt from his horse and ran to help her, grabbing one of the heavy wooden doors as a gust threatened to rip it from Katie's hands. Together, they managed to close and bolt both doors just as hail began to fall, pelting the ground around them like bullets. We need to get inside, Nick shouted over the storm's fury, pointing to the house. Katie nodded, and they made a dash across the yard, the hail stinging their skin. They burst through the kitchen door, soaked to the bone and breathing hard. That came up fast, Katie gasped, pushing her dripping hair from her face. Nick nodded, water pooling at his feet. The cattle are fine. They headed for the shelter of the trees before it got bad. They stood for a moment, just looking at each other, both suddenly aware of their proximity in the small kitchen, of their wet clothes clinging to their bodies. Something electric passed between them that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. Katie broke the moment first, turning to fetch towels. You should get out of those wet things before you catch your death. I'll head back to my cabin once the hail stops, Nick said, accepting the towel she offered. Don't be ridiculous, Katie replied, her voice brisk but her eyes avoiding his. The storm's only getting worse. You can borrow some of Pa's old clothes. They might be a bit short in the sleeves, but they'll be dry. Before Nick could protest, she disappeared into what had been her father's bedroom, returning moments later with a flannel shirt and worn denims. You can change in there, she said, gesturing to the room. I'll make some coffee. When Nick emerged, the old clothes fitting better than expected, he found Katie had also changed into a simple house dress, her wet hair braided down her back. She stood at the stove, stirring a pot that smelled tantalizingly of beef stew. I thought we could use something warm, she said, glancing up at him. Storm like this chills you to the bone. Nick moved to stand beside her, looking down at the simmering stew. Smells like your father's recipe. He taught you well. Katie's smile was tinged with sadness. He made sure I could handle everything on my own. Said a woman in the territories needed to be twice as capable as any man. She stirred the pot thoughtfully. I don't think he ever imagined I'd actually be alone, though. You're not alone, Nick said quietly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to vanish. Katie was again the spirited girl who'd stolen his heart, and Nick the earnest young man who'd promised her the world. No, she agreed softly. I'm not alone anymore. They ate at the kitchen table, the storm raging outside while they remained in their small island of warmth and light. As the evening wore on, their conversation flowed more freely than it had since Nick's return. They spoke of the years they'd spent apart, Nick's travels through Montana and Wyoming, the skills he'd learned, the people he'd met. Katie told him about how she'd taken on more responsibility at the ranch as her father aged, how she'd fought to be taken seriously by the neighboring ranchers. Do you remember Old Man Jenkins' face when I outbid him for that Hereford bull at the county auction? Katie laughed, refilling their coffee cups. Nick grinned. I thought he'd bust a blood vessel right there in the auction yard. Couldn't stand being bested by Frank Zamora's girl. That bull sired the best calves we ever had, Katie said proudly. Pa let me make those decisions the last few years. Said I had a better eye for good stock than he did. He was right, Nick said, watching her face in the lamplight. You always could see value where others missed it. The double meaning wasn't lost on either of them. Katie's cheeks flushed slightly as she met his gaze. Some things are worth a second look, she said carefully. Worth a second chance. Nick's heart quickened. Katie, a particularly violent crash of thunder shook the house, making them both jump. The lamp flickered, then steadied. I should check the windows, Katie said, rising quickly. This old house leaks like a sieve in bad weather. Nick followed her through the house, helping to secure shutters and place buckets under the few places where the roof leaked. The simple domestic task felt strangely intimate, the two of them moving around each other with increasing ease, anticipating needs, working in tandem. When the last window was secured, they found themselves standing in the doorway to the parlor, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. I've missed this, Nick said suddenly. Not just you, though God knows I've missed you every day, but this place, this land, the feeling of belonging somewhere. Katie looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. Have you found it again? That feeling? I'm starting to, he answered honestly. Every day a little more. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Katie took a small step closer to him. Nick, I need to know something, she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. If things had been different, if Blackwood hadn't threatened you, would you have stayed? Yes, Nick said without hesitation. I would have married you, just like I promised. Built us a home, raised horses, had children. Everything we talked about under the stars that summer. Katie's breath caught. You remember. Every word, Nick said, his voice rough with emotion. Every dream we shared. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Nick raised his hand to her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek. Katie leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "I was so angry with you," she whispered. "For so long." "You had every right to be," he said. "I broke my promise to you." "But you came back," Katie said, opening her eyes to look at him. "When it mattered most, you came back." The distance between them vanished as Katie rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question being asked and answered. Then Nick's arms went around her waist, drawing her closer, and the years of separation melted away in the heat that flared between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, the storm outside seemed to have receded, or perhaps they simply no longer noticed its fury. "Stay," Katie whispered against his lips. "Not just tonight. Not just as my foreman. Stay with me, Nick Everett." Nick looked into her eyes, seeing the future he'd thought lost forever. "Katherine Zamora, there is nowhere else in this world I'd rather be." As summer yielded to fall, the Zamora ranch flourished under their joint care. The story of Sheriff Blackwood's crimes and Nick's dramatic return had spread throughout the territory, bringing both notoriety and a certain respect to Katie and Nick's door. Blackwood had been transferred to Tucson to await trial, his influence finally broken when 3 other ranchers came forward with similar stories of intimidation and fraud. Deputy Collins proved to be a fair and honest sheriff, working to rebuild the town's trust in law enforcement. On a crisp October afternoon, Nick found Katie in the north pasture, checking on a mare that was due to foal. She sat astride her chestnut gelding, surveying the land that stretched before them, golden in the autumn light. "Penny for your thoughts," Nick called as he rode up beside her. Katie smiled, a full, unreserved smile that still made his heart skip. "I was thinking about my father, about how much he loved this land." She gestured toward the distant mountains. "He used to say that God took a little extra time when he made this valley." He wasn't wrong, Nick agreed, looking not at the landscape but at Katie, her hair catching copper highlights in the sun. In the months since that stormy night, their relationship had blossomed, healing old wounds and creating new bonds. They worked side by side during the days, and in the evenings, they would sit on the porch, planning for their future. "The mare looks ready to deliver any day now," Katie observed, turning her attention back to the pregnant horse grazing peacefully nearby. "That's actually why I came looking for you," Nick said. "I need to show you something. Can you come back to the ranch house?" Curiosity piqued, Katie followed Nick back to the main house. When they arrived, he led her to the workshop behind the barn, a place she rarely entered since it had been her father's private domain. "Close your eyes," Nick said as they reached the door. "Nick Everett, what are you up to?" Katie laughed but complied. She heard him open the door, felt his hand gentle on her arm as he guided her inside. The familiar smell of wood shavings and leather filled her nostrils. "All right, open them." Katie opened her eyes and gasped. In the center of the workshop stood a beautiful wooden cradle, intricately carved with a pattern of wildflowers and horses. "Nick," she breathed, stepping forward to run her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful. But we don't." "I know," he said quickly. "It's not for us. Not yet, anyway." A blush crept up his neck. "It's for Mary Collins. Sheriff Collins' wife is expecting their first child in December, remember? I thought it would make a nice gift from the ranch." Katie's heart swelled with love for this man who thought of others, who used his hands to create beauty and kindness. "It's perfect," she said softly. Nick moved to stand behind the cradle, suddenly looking nervous. "There's something else, Katie. Something I've been wanting to ask you." Katie's pulse quickened as Nick reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. "I know we've been rebuilding what we had," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Learning to trust each other again, finding our way forward. But I don't want to wait any longer to make this official." He opened the pouch and tipped a ring into his palm, a delicate gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. I had it made in Tucson, he explained. The pearl reminded me of how something beautiful can come from years of pressure and patience. Katie's eyes filled with tears as Nick came around the cradle to stand before her, taking her hand in his. Katherine Zamora, I've loved you since we were barely more than children. I lost you once through fear and foolishness, and I've been given a second chance I don't deserve. I promise to spend every day of the rest of my life earning your trust and your love. He dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. Will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner, the mother of my children? Katie didn't hesitate. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with joy. Yes, Nick Everett, I will marry you. As he slid the ring onto her finger, then rose to seal their engagement with a kiss, Katie knew that the hardships they had endured had only made this moment sweeter, this love deeper. They were married on Christmas Eve in the same church where, just months earlier, Katie had nearly been forced into a loveless marriage. But this time, as she walked down the aisle toward Nick, her heart was full to bursting with love and hope. The entire town turned out for the wedding, which doubled as a Christmas celebration. The church glowed with candlelight, evergreen boughs decorated every surface, and the atmosphere was one of genuine joy and community healing. Sheriff Collins and his very pregnant wife Mary sat in the front row, beaming at the couple. Even Reverend Wallace, who had nearly been forced to perform a sham ceremony, seemed rejuvenated by the genuine love being celebrated in his church. As Katie and Nick exchanged their vows, promising to love and honor each other until death parted them, a light snow began to fall outside, dusting Willow Springs with a blanket of white, a clean slate, a fresh beginning. The reception was held at the town hall, where tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family in the community. Music filled the air as townsfolk danced and celebrated not just the union of two beloved citizens, but the freedom they all felt with Blackwood's shadow finally lifted. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued around them, Nick pulled Katie into a quiet corner. "Mrs. Everett," he said, still savoring the sound of her new name. "Are you happy?" Katie looked up at her husband, at the face she had loved for so long, through separation and pain and, finally, joyful reunion. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Nick's hand gently rested on her stomach, a question in his eyes. They had been trying for a baby since their engagement, hoping to start their family right away. Katie covered his hand with hers, a secret smile playing at her lips. "I was going to wait until tomorrow to tell you. Consider it a Christmas present." Nick's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "The doctor confirmed it yesterday." Katie nodded, her eyes shining. "Next summer, that beautiful cradle you made will have an occupant of its own." Nick lifted her off her feet, spinning her around as joy overwhelmed him. Nearby dancers paused to look at them curiously. "Careful," Katie laughed as he set her down. "You'll start rumors before we're ready to announce it." "Let them talk," Nick said, drawing her close for a kiss that promised a lifetime of love. "Some things are too wonderful to keep secret." As they rejoined the dancing, moving together in perfect harmony, Katie marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From childhood friends to young lovers, torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, only to find each other again when it seemed all hope was lost. Spring came early that year, bringing with it new calves, foals, and the promise of abundant crops. Katie's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body blossoming with new life as the land around them renewed itself. On a perfect June morning, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and the sun warm on her back, Katie felt the first contractions. Nick was at her side throughout the long labor, his steady presence a comfort as she brought their child into the world. As dawn broke the following day, Their daughter made her entrance with a lusty cry that spoke of strength and determination, traits she had clearly inherited from both parents. "She's perfect," Nick whispered, cradling the tiny bundle in his arms, awestruck by the miniature features that somehow combined the best of himself and Katie. "What shall we call her?" Katie asked, exhausted but radiant as she watched her husband and daughter. Nick looked from the baby to his wife, his heart so full it seemed it might burst. "What about Hope?" "Because that's what she is, the hope we never gave up on, even when everything seemed darkest." "Hope Frances Everett," Katie nodded, incorporating her father's name. "It's beautiful." In the years that followed, the Everett family thrived. The ranch grew prosperous under their careful stewardship, and their family expanded to include 2 more children, twin boys who arrived 2 years after Hope, bringing twice the joy and mischief to the household. Sheriff Collins became the territorial marshal, his honest leadership helping to bring stability to the entire region. Blackwood was convicted of multiple crimes and sentenced to 20 years in prison, where he died of pneumonia during his 5th year of incarceration. Willow Springs itself grew into a respectable town, with a school, a proper doctor's office, and even a small library that Katie helped establish. The railroad came through, but thanks to Nick's foresight and negotiations, it benefited the town rather than exploiting it. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Nick surprised Katie with a trip to San Francisco, a second honeymoon to celebrate not just their marriage, but the life they had built together. They stayed in the finest hotel, attended the opera, and walked arm in arm along the bay, marveling at how far they had come from that dramatic confrontation in the church. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Katie asked as they stood on their hotel balcony, looking out at the city lights reflecting on the water. Nick drew her into his arms, breathing in the scent of her hair, still as intoxicating to him as it had been when they were young. "Sometimes. But then I look at you, at our children, at everything we've built together, and I know that this was always our path. We just took a detour along the way." Katie turned in his embrace to face him. At 34, she was more beautiful than ever, confidence and happiness having added a glow that no hardship could diminish. "I used to believe that true love meant an easy path," she said thoughtfully. "Now I know better. True love is finding your way back to each other, no matter how many obstacles stand in your way. And fighting for what matters," Nick added, thinking of that day in the church when he had faced down a corrupt sheriff to reclaim his future. "And fighting for what matters," Katie agreed, rising on her toes to kiss her husband as the stars came out over San Francisco Bay, each one a testament to dreams that, against all odds, had finally come true. When they returned to Willow Springs, life resumed its pleasant rhythm. Hope, now 9 and already showing her mother's affinity for horses, took on more responsibilities around the ranch. The twins, Nathan and Noah, wild as young colts, filled the house with laughter and the occasional broken dish. The Everett Ranch, as it came to be known throughout the territory, became famous for its quality horses, with buyers coming from as far as Texas and California to purchase their stock. Nick's reputation as a trainer grew, while Katie's business acumen ensured their prosperity. On Hope's 16th birthday, Nick took his daughter riding at dawn, just the 2 of them. As they sat atop a ridge overlooking the valley that had been her playground since birth, he told her the full story of how he had almost lost her mother, of the courage it had taken for both of them to trust again after so much pain. "Your mother is the bravest person I've ever known," Nick said, watching the sunrise paint the landscape in hues of gold and pink. "And the most forgiving." Hope, who had her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes, nodded thoughtfully. "Is that why you named me Hope? Because you and Mama found hope again?" Nick smiled at his perceptive daughter. "Exactly that. You were the promise of everything we dreamed of during those years apart. The embodiment of the faith we kept, even when it seemed foolish." When they returned to the ranch, Katie was waiting on the porch, somehow knowing that this ride had been more than just a birthday adventure. She embraced her daughter, then her husband, understanding without words passing between them that another precious piece of their legacy had been shared. That evening, as the extended family, including Sheriff Collins and his wife Mary, whose children had grown up alongside the Everett brood, gathered to celebrate Hope's birthday, Katie found a moment alone with Nick in the kitchen. "I saw you and Hope riding out this morning," she said, slicing the birthday cake she had baked. "You told her a story?" Nick nodded, coming to stand behind her, his hands resting lightly on her hips. "I wanted her to know where she came from, the love that created her." Katie leaned back against his chest, still finding comfort in his solid presence after all these years. "I was thinking earlier about that day in the church. How terrified I was, how hopeless everything seemed. And then I burst in, like some dime novel hero," Nick chuckled. "Not my most subtle moment." Katie turned in his arms. "You were exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed you most. Just as you've been every day since." The sounds of their families celebrating drifted in from the other room, laughter, conversation, the twins arguing good-naturedly over something inconsequential. "We created all this," Katie marveled, gesturing toward the noise. "From nothing but love and determination." Nick looked down at his wife, still seeing in her face the young girl he had fallen in love with more than 20 years earlier. "And we're just getting started, Mrs. Everett. Just getting started." As they rejoined their guests, cake in hand, Nick and Katie exchanged a look that spoke volumes of past trials overcome, of present joys embraced, and of a future stretching before them, as vast and promising as the western horizon at dawn. In that moment, surrounded by the family and community they had built together, they both knew with absolute certainty that the forced wedding that never happened had been the beginning of their greatest adventure, a love story written across the wild and beautiful landscape of their shared life, a story still unfolding with each passing day.